You're not invited to the leadership retreat. That's what Richard Brennan said on November 4, 2024 at 3:47 p.m. in his executive office at Horizon Capital Management, informing me that the annual 3-day strategic planning retreat for senior leadership, which I'd attended every year for the past 8 years as Director of Compliance and Risk Management, would proceed without me because the executive team wanted frank discussions about growth strategy without compliance concerns slowing down strategic thinking, his tone making it clear that compliance oversight was an obstacle to ambitious decision-making rather than a legal requirement for a registered investment advisor managing $8.4 billion in client assets. The afternoon sun through his corner office windows illuminated the framed Forbes article about Horizon's innovative investment strategies, while I stood holding my laptop containing 8 years of compliance documentation showing that every major strategic decision required regulatory review, risk assessment, and documented approval from someone who actually understood SEC regulations, FINRA requirements, and the fiduciary duties that governed every aspect of how investment advisors could manage client money. I'd been Horizon's Director of Compliance and Risk Management for 8 years, 3 months, and 14 days, responsible for regulatory compliance, risk assessment, policy implementation, and ensuring that Horizon's investment strategies complied with the Investment Advisors Act of 1940 and the regulations that protected clients from advisors making decisions based on profit rather than client interests, and Richard, who'd been hired as CEO 18 months earlier from a hedge fund known for aggressive strategies and minimal regulatory constraints, had decided that strategic planning worked better without the compliance officer who kept pointing out which strategies violated regulations and which client representations exceeded what was legally permissible. I'm Margaret Chen, and I stood in that office knowing exactly what SEC Rule 206(4)-7 required, that registered investment advisors must adopt and implement written compliance policies and procedures reasonably designed to prevent violations of the Advisors Act, and that compliance officers must have authority to review and approve material business decisions before implementation, and knowing that excluding the compliance director from strategic planning meetings where material business decisions would be made violated both the letter and spirit of those compliance requirements. 8 years, 3 months, and 14 days of reviewing investment strategies for regulatory compliance, identifying conflicts of interest that required disclosure or mitigation, implementing policies that protected client interests, conducting annual compliance reviews that survived SEC examinations without significant findings, and maintaining the regulatory framework that allowed Horizon to operate as a fiduciary investment advisor rather than as a sales organization pushing products that generated fees regardless of client suitability. And Richard had decided that my insistence on regulatory compliance before strategy implementation made me an impediment to frank discussions, rather than the person whose job was specifically to ensure those discussions didn't produce strategies that violated securities regulations. I wasn't the chief investment officer who made portfolio allocation decisions and presented at client meetings, or the chief financial officer who managed firm finances and reported to the board. I drove a 2018 Toyota RAV4 with 87,934 miles and a back seat containing printed SEC guidance releases and FINRA regulatory notices I reviewed during lunch because understanding current regulatory requirements meant reading primary sources rather than relying on summaries from consultants who didn't understand investment advisor regulations. I lived in a 780-square-foot condo with a home office containing binders of compliance policies, SEC examination reports, client disclosure documents, and correspondence with regulators documenting 8 years of maintaining compliance that had kept Horizon free from enforcement actions while competitors faced penalties for violations we'd specifically avoided. I was methodical about compliance review, careful about documentation, and protective of the regulatory framework that distinguished fiduciary advisors from broker-dealers, and apparently Richard thought these characteristics made me someone who should be excluded from strategic planning rather than the person whose compliance expertise is legally required to be part of any discussion about material changes to how we manage client assets. I joined Horizon Capital Management in August 2016 as compliance manager when they were a growing registered investment advisor with $2.8 billion in assets under management. Horizon provided investment advisory services to high-net-worth individuals, family offices, and small institutional clients, emphasizing long-term value investing with personalized portfolio management. As a registered investment advisor under the Investment Advisors Act of 1940, Horizon had fiduciary duties to clients that required putting client interests first, providing full disclosure of conflicts of interest, and making investment recommendations based on suitability and client objectives rather than on what generated the highest fees for the firm. My role was to ensure Horizon maintained compliance with these fiduciary duties and with the extensive regulations governing investment advisors. This included developing and implementing compliance policies, reviewing marketing materials for accuracy, conducting annual compliance reviews, coordinating SEC examinations, training staff on regulatory requirements, and reviewing proposed strategies or business changes for regulatory implications. I was promoted to Director of Compliance and Risk Management in 2018 with expanded responsibility for enterprise risk assessment and oversight of Horizon's compliance program. The role reported directly to the CEO and to the board's audit committee, with explicit authority to review and approve material business decisions before implementation. For the first 7 years, this structure worked well. When executives proposed new investment strategies, I reviewed them for regulatory compliance. When marketing wanted to make performance claims, I verified they were accurate and appropriately qualified. When the firm considered new business lines or client types, I assessed regulatory implications and ensured we had proper policies and disclosures. The annual leadership retreat was a key part of strategic planning. Each November, Horizon's executive team, CEO, CIO, CFO, COO, heads of client services and business development, and me, spent 3 days at a resort reviewing performance, discussing strategic priorities, and making decisions about the coming year's direction. My participation ensured that strategic decisions were reviewed for compliance implications before being finalized. This changed in June 2023 when Richard Brennan was hired as CEO. Richard came from Apex Capital, a hedge fund that operated under different regulations than registered investment advisors. Hedge funds serve sophisticated investors and have fewer regulatory constraints than fiduciary advisors serving retail clients. Richard's experience was in aggressive trading strategies, leverage, and complex financial instruments that generated high returns but carried substantial risks. Richard's mandate from Horizon's board was to accelerate growth and increase profitability. Horizon had stable but modest margins typical of fiduciary advisors. Our fee structures were transparent, our strategies were conservative, and our growth came from client referrals and reputation rather than aggressive marketing or product pushing. Richard wanted to change this. He talked about modernizing Horizon's approach, optimizing fee structures, and diversifying revenue streams. What this meant in practice was adopting strategies and business practices that pushed the boundaries of what was appropriate for a fiduciary advisor. In August 2023, Richard proposed implementing performance-based fees for certain clients. Performance fees, where the advisor charges a percentage of investment gains, create conflicts of interest because they incentivize advisors to take excessive risks to generate higher fees. The SEC allows performance fees only for qualified clients with substantial assets and only with proper disclosure and safeguards. I reviewed Richard's proposal and identified several problems. The proposed fee structure didn't adequately disclose risks to clients. The qualifying asset thresholds weren't properly verified. The performance calculation methodology could be manipulated to show gains while obscuring losses. And most importantly, the proposal didn't include the required compliance review and approval process before implementation. I documented these concerns in a compliance review memo on August 15, 2023. I explained the regulatory requirements, identified the specific problems with the proposal, and recommended modifications necessary for compliance. Richard's response came in a meeting on August 18. Margaret, I appreciate the detailed review, but I think you're being overly conservative. Performance fees are common in the industry. We need to compete with other advisors who offer them. Your compliance concerns are theoretical risks that we can manage operationally. They're not theoretical risks, they're regulatory requirements, I replied. The SEC has specific rules about performance fees. The proposal as written doesn't meet those requirements. If we implement it without modifications, we're creating enforcement risk. We'll refine the implementation details, Richard said. But the strategic decision is made. We're moving forward with performance fees. The strategic decision should be subject to compliance approval before implementation, I said carefully. That's what SEC Rule 206, 4-7 requires compliance review of material business changes before they're finalized. I'm not asking for permission, Richard replied. I'm informing you of the decision. Your job is to help implement it compliantly, not to block strategic initiatives. This became a pattern over the next 15 months. Richard would propose strategies or business changes without compliance review. I would identify regulatory problems. Richard would dismiss the concerns as overly conservative or theoretical and proceed with implementation while asking me to handle the compliance details. By November 2024, I'd documented multiple concerning practices. Performance fees implemented without proper disclosures or safeguards, marketing materials making return projections that exceeded SEC guidelines, expense allocation practices that shifted costs to certain clients, disproportionately trading practices that prioritized high-fee accounts over other clients, compensation structures that incentivized advisors to recommend higher-fee products regardless of client suitability. Each practice had been documented in compliance memos identifying regulatory problems and recommending corrections. Each memo had been dismissed or ignored by Richard, who treated compliance review as bureaucratic obstruction rather than legal requirement. On November 4, 2024, Richard called me to his office to inform me I wouldn't be attending the November 18, 20 leadership retreat. This year's retreat will focus on aggressive growth strategies and revenue optimization, Richard explained. We need frank discussions about how to scale the business without getting bogged down in compliance concerns. You're not being excluded because your work isn't valued, you're being excluded because we need space for strategic thinking without immediate operational constraints. Compliance isn't an operational constraint, I said. It's a legal requirement. Material business decisions require compliance review before implementation. That's not optional for registered investment advisors. We'll brief you on the decisions after the retreat, Richard replied. You can do compliance review during implementation planning. That's backwards, I said. Compliance review happens before strategic decisions are finalized, not after. If you make decisions at the retreat that violate regulations, discovering that during implementation doesn't help, you've already committed to strategies that aren't compliant. Margaret, you're thinking about this wrong. Strategic planning is about identifying opportunities and setting direction. Compliance review is about execution details. We're separating those functions to allow more creative strategic thinking. Strategic planning for a registered investment advisor can't be separated from compliance, I replied. The regulations govern what strategies we're allowed to pursue. Making strategic decisions without understanding regulatory constraints means making decisions you may not be able to implement legally. That's a risk we're willing to take, Richard said. The decision is final. You're not attending the retreat. I left Richard's office knowing that whatever decisions were made during that retreat would likely violate securities regulations, and that I would have no documentation of what was decided or opportunity to provide compliance input before implementation. Now about 74% of you think I'm about to show up at the retreat uninvited to spy on their discussions or somehow sabotage their planning, and you're completely wrong. Subscribe right now, because what actually happens is that I document the exclusion from strategic planning as a compliance violation. I continue my normal compliance work, including preparing for Horizon's routine SEC examination scheduled for early 2025. And when SEC examiners ask to review documentation of compliance approval for major strategic decisions made in late 2024, I provide detailed records showing I was deliberately excluded from the planning process where those decisions were made. Which triggers an expanded examination into whether Horizon's compliance program meets regulatory requirements, leading to discovery of all the undisclosed conflicts, improper fee practices, and material business changes that were implemented without proper compliance review. I didn't crash the retreat or spy on their discussions. Instead, I did exactly what compliance professionals are supposed to do. I documented the compliance program failure and continued preparing for regulatory examination. On November 5, 2024, I sent an email to Richard and the board's audit committee. Subject: Compliance Program Concern, Exclusion from Strategic Planning. This email documents a material compliance program issue. As Director of Compliance and Risk Management, I have been excluded from the November 18, 20 leadership retreat where strategic planning and material business decisions will occur. SEC Rule 206-4 7 requires that registered investment advisors maintain compliance programs with authority to review material business decisions. Excluding compliance from strategic planning meetings violates this requirement and creates risk that material decisions will be made without required regulatory review. I am documenting this exclusion to establish a record that any strategic decisions made during the retreat occurred without compliance review or approval as required by SEC regulations. Please confirm whether this exclusion represents a permanent change to compliance program authority or whether this is an isolated incident. The Audit Committee Chair, Patricia Morrison, called me the next day. "Margaret, I received your email about the retreat exclusion. This concerns me. Why is Richard excluding you from strategic planning?" He stated that the executive team needs frank discussions about growth strategies without compliance concerns slowing down strategic thinking. He wants to make strategic decisions first and bring me in during implementation to handle compliance details. "That's not how our compliance program is supposed to work," Patricia said. "You're supposed to have input before decisions are finalized." That's correct. And that's why I'm documenting the exclusion. If strategic decisions are made without compliance review, and those decisions later create regulatory problems, the SEC will ask why our compliance program failed to prevent violations. I need a record showing I was excluded from the process. "I'll discuss this with Richard," Patricia said. 2 days later, Richard called me. "Margaret, I understand you've escalated the retreat issue to the Audit Committee." "That wasn't necessary. This is an operational decision about meeting structure, not a compliance program change." "Excluding compliance from strategic planning is a compliance program change," I replied. "It changes whether compliance has authority to review decisions before they're finalized." "You're being overly formal about this. It's one meeting. It's the annual strategic planning meeting where material business decisions are made. And based on the compliance review denials I've experienced over the past 15 months, I'm concerned that decisions will be made without proper regulatory analysis." "Your concerns are noted," Richard said curtly, ending the call. The leadership retreat proceeded November 18th to 20th without me. I wasn't informed what was discussed or what decisions were made. In late November and early December, I began seeing implementation of strategies that had clearly been decided at the retreat: launch of a new, alternative investment platform offering clients access to private equity and hedge fund investments, implementation of enhanced fee structures that included transaction fees, platform fees, and performance fees layered on top of advisory fees, new marketing campaign claiming Horizon could consistently outperform market benchmarks, expansion into cryptocurrency advisory services, changes to account allocation practices that prioritized high-fee accounts. Each of these changes raised significant compliance concerns. Alternative investments required different disclosures and suitability analysis. Layered fee structures needed to be clearly disclosed and justified. Performance claims needed to be substantiated and properly qualified. Cryptocurrency advisory raised unique regulatory and custody issues. Account allocation changes potentially created conflicts of interest. None of these changes had been reviewed by compliance before announcement. I learned about them from staff meetings, marketing materials, and client-facing documents that were already being distributed. I documented each change and the compliance concerns in detailed memos throughout December 2024. I sent these memos to Richard, the executive team, and the audit committee. I explained which regulations were implicated, what disclosures were required, what approvals were needed, and what modifications were necessary for compliance. The responses were dismissive. Richard characterized my concerns as resistance to innovation and compliance overreach. The executive team proceeded with implementation while asking me to update policies to accommodate the new strategies, rather than reviewing whether the strategies were appropriate for a fiduciary advisor. On January 7, 2025, I received notification that the SEC had scheduled a routine examination of Horizon Capital Management beginning February 3, 2025. The SEC conducts periodic examinations of registered investment advisors to verify compliance with regulations. These examinations review compliance programs, investment advisory practices, fee structures, marketing materials, and operational controls. I began preparing for the examination as I did every year, organizing documentation, reviewing policies, coordinating staff availability, and preparing materials the examiners would request. This examination would be different because the SEC would now be reviewing strategic decisions made without compliance involvement and business practices implemented without proper compliance approval. The SEC examination began on February 3, 2025. Two examiners, Sarah Williams and James Park, spent the first day reviewing Horizon's compliance program and meeting with me to understand our processes. Ms. Chen, please walk us through how compliance reviews material business decisions before implementation, Sarah requested. Until November 2024, I participated in strategic planning meetings where material decisions were discussed. I provided compliance input before decisions were finalized. Beginning in November 2024, I was excluded from strategic planning, and material business decisions have been made without compliance review. The examiners exchanged glances. Can you provide documentation showing compliance review and approval of major business changes in the past year? James asked. I provided comprehensive documentation. Compliance memos from 2023 and early 2024 reviewing various proposals with my recommendations records showing which recommendations were implemented and which were dismissed. My November 5 email documenting exclusion from the retreat memos from December 2024 and January 2025 documenting compliance concerns about changes implemented without my review. Evidence showing that alternative investments, enhanced fees, performance marketing claims, cryptocurrency services, and allocation changes were all implemented without compliance approval. These memos show you identified compliance concerns about these practices, Sarah said. But they were implemented anyway? Correct. The CEO's position is that strategic decisions are made first, and compliance review happens during implementation to handle the details. That's contrary to SEC requirements for compliance program authority. Who made the decisions to implement these changes without compliance approval? James asked. They were made at the November 2024 leadership retreat that I was excluded from. The examiners spent the next 3 weeks conducting an expanded examination. They interviewed executives about how decisions were made. They reviewed marketing materials for accuracy. They examined fee structures for proper disclosure. They analyzed trading practices for potential conflicts. They assessed the alternative investment platform for suitability procedures. On February 28, 2025, the examiners held an exit conference with Richard, the CFO, and me to discuss preliminary findings. Sarah began, our examination has identified material compliance program deficiencies. Horizon's compliance program does not meet SEC Rule 206(4)-7 requirements because the compliance officer lacks authority to review and approve material business decisions before implementation. We have a robust compliance program, Richard argued. Ms. Chen reviews all our practices and maintains comprehensive policies. After decisions are already made and implemented, Sarah replied. Rule 206(4)-7 requires that compliance review happen before implementation, not as a post hoc assessment. Your exclusion of Ms. Chen from strategic planning where material decisions were made demonstrates that compliance doesn't have the required authority. James continued, we've also identified specific violations of the Advisors Act related to practices implemented without compliance review. 1. The alternative investment platform lacks adequate suitability procedures and required disclosures about risks, conflicts, and fees. 2. The enhanced fee structures were not properly disclosed to clients before implementation, violating fee disclosure requirements. 3. Marketing materials contain performance claims that are not substantiated and are not properly qualified with risk disclosures. 4. Cryptocurrency advisory services were offered without proper custody arrangements, violating custody rules. 5. Account allocation practices create conflicts of interest that were not disclosed to clients. These violations appear to stem from the compliance program deficiency. Decisions were made without compliance review that would have identified the regulatory problems before implementation. Richard looked shocked. These are operational details that can be corrected. They're not material violations. They're material violations of fiduciary duty, Sarah said. And they occurred because you deliberately excluded compliance from decision-making. That's not an operational detail, that's a compliance program failure that enabled multiple regulatory violations. The SEC's formal examination report was issued on March 21, 2025. The report cited Horizon 4, compliance program deficiencies, failure to give compliance adequate authority, failure to disclose conflicts of interest, inadequate fee disclosures, misleading marketing materials, custody rule violations, suitability procedure failures. The report recommended enforcement action and required Horizon to submit a comprehensive remediation plan within 30 days. On March 25, 2025, Horizon's board held an emergency meeting. I was asked to present the examination findings and explain what had occurred. I provided comprehensive documentation, my compliance memos identifying problems with proposed strategies, Richard's dismissals of those concerns, my exclusion from the November retreat, the strategic decisions made without my review, and the resulting violations that the SEC had identified. Patricia Morrison, the audit committee chair, asked the key question, Ms. Chen, in your professional opinion, would these violations have occurred if you had been included in the strategic planning process? No. Each violation resulted from decisions made without compliance review. I identified similar issues in previous proposals and provided recommendations that prevented violations. If I'd participated in the November retreat, I would have identified the regulatory problems with these strategies before they were implemented. Why didn't you object more forcefully when you were excluded from the retreat? A board member asked. I documented the exclusion in writing to the audit committee on November 5. I raised concerns about the compliance program authority issue. I was told it was an operational decision about meeting structure. After the retreat, I documented compliance concerns about each implemented strategy and sent detailed memos to executive leadership and the audit committee explaining the regulatory problems. Those memos were dismissed as resistance to innovation. The board reviewed the documentation. The pattern was clear. I had consistently identified compliance problems, Richard had consistently dismissed those concerns, and the resulting violations had occurred exactly as I'd warned they would. Richard was terminated as CEO on March 28, 2025. The board's statement cited failure to maintain adequate compliance program oversight resulting in material SEC examination findings. The board offered me the position of Chief Compliance Officer reporting directly to the board rather than to the CEO, with enhanced authority over all material business decisions and explicit authority to halt implementation of any strategy that raised compliance concerns. The role paid $195,000 annually, a 48% increase from my previous salary, plus equity compensation. I was accepted on April 2, 2025. Horizon's remediation process took 6 months. We rolled back the alternative investment platform until proper procedures were implemented. We revised and properly disclosed fee structures. We corrected marketing materials. We exited cryptocurrency advisory. We restructured account allocation practices with proper conflict disclosures. We implemented new policies requiring written compliance approval before any material business change. The SEC accepted our remediation plan but imposed a civil penalty of $2.4 million and required an independent compliance consultant to monitor Horizon for 2 years. Several clients terminated their relationships due to concerns about the violations. Horizon's reputation as a trustworthy fiduciary advisor was damaged. On September 15, 2025, I ran into Richard at an industry conference. He was working as a consultant advising investment firms on growth strategies. Margaret. I heard you're now Chief Compliance Officer at Horizon. Congratulations. The board needed someone who would actually enforce compliance requirements rather than treating them as suggestions. The SEC findings were overblown, Richard said. Those were technical violations, not material harm to clients. They were violations of fiduciary duty that occurred because you deliberately excluded compliance from strategic planning, I replied. The SEC found that every major violation stemmed from decisions made at the retreat I was barred from attending. If you'd included me in that planning, would have identified the regulatory problems before implementation. You would have blocked every growth strategy with compliance objections. I would have identified which strategies violated regulations and which were permissible. That's literally the compliance officer's job. You didn't want compliance input because you knew I'd tell you that your aggressive strategies weren't appropriate for a fiduciary advisor. So you excluded me, made decisions without regulatory review, and implemented practices that violated multiple SEC rules. The examination findings proved that approach doesn't work. I was hired to accelerate growth, Richard said defensively. You were hired to grow the firm while maintaining compliance with securities regulations. Those aren't contradictory objectives, they're both required for a registered investment advisor. You treated compliance as an obstacle instead of as a legal framework. That resulted in $2.4 million in penalties, lost clients, reputational damage, and your termination. The growth you achieved came at the cost of violations that destroyed trust. Richard didn't respond. The leadership retreat where you excluded me? I continued. Every material decision made at that retreat violated regulations. Alternative investments without proper procedures. Layered fees without adequate disclosure. Performance marketing claims without substantiation. Cryptocurrency services without custody compliance. All implemented without compliance review, all identified as violations by SEC examiners, all exactly the kind of problems that compliance review prevents. You thought excluding me would allow frank discussions without compliance concerns. What it actually allowed was making decisions that violated securities laws. Here's what they don't teach executives about compliance. It's not bureaucratic obstruction, it's regulatory expertise that prevents violations. Compliance officers aren't obstacles to growth, they're guides to growing within legal boundaries. Excluding compliance from strategic planning doesn't enable better strategies, it enables violations that trigger enforcement actions. Richard thought excluding me from the retreat would allow frank discussions and creative strategic thinking without compliance concerns slowing down decision-making. What it actually allowed was making strategic decisions that violated fiduciary duties, misleading clients about fees and risks, and implementing practices that the SEC identified as material violations requiring penalties and remediation. The math is simple. Horizon paid me $132,000 annually to prevent regulatory violations through compliance review. Richard excluded me from strategic planning to avoid compliance input that would slow down aggressive growth strategies. Those strategies generated approximately $3.2 million in additional revenue over 4 months before the SEC examination. The violations resulted in $2.4 million in penalties, lost clients representing $4.8 million in annual revenue, 2 years of independent monitoring, and reputational damage that will affect new business for years. You want to exclude compliance from strategic planning to enable frank discussions? Go ahead. But remember that those frank discussions about strategies that push regulatory boundaries tend to cross those boundaries, and that SEC examiners will eventually ask to see documentation of compliance approval for material business decisions, and that we excluded compliance from the planning process isn't a defense against violations, it's evidence that your compliance program failed. Richard called compliance oversight an obstacle to strategic thinking. The SEC called it a required element of registered investment advisor operations. Horizon's board called me Chief Compliance Officer with enhanced authority and direct board reporting after learning that excluding compliance from planning resulted in material violations. I kept my RAV4 with 87,934 miles. I kept my binders of compliance policies and SEC guidance releases. I kept the methodical approach to regulatory review that had kept Horizon violation-free for 8 years until someone decided that compliance input slowed down strategic thinking. Richard is consulting on growth strategies for investment firms, which is ironic given that his growth strategies resulted in SEC violations and his termination. Horizon is rebuilding its compliance program under board oversight that ensures compliance has actual authority over material decisions. And I'm implementing the compliance framework that should have existed before someone decided that annual strategic planning worked better without the person whose job was ensuring those plans complied with securities regulations. Not invited to the leadership retreat where strategic decisions are made? Perfect documentation that any resulting violations occurred without compliance review. When SEC examiners asked to see compliance approval for material business changes, the compliance director was excluded from planning, explains exactly why the compliance program failed to prevent violations. Sometimes the person excluded from meetings is the person whose absence allows everyone else to make decisions they shouldn't make. And sometimes, "you're not invited" becomes the documentation that proves whatever went wrong happened because the person whose job was preventing it wasn't allowed in the room where it was decided.